Welcome, everyone, to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research virtually. My name is Julia Rothkopf, and I'm the Program Associate at YIVO. Today, we have Joseph Berger joining us for a book talk about his new book, Elie Wiesel, Confronting the Silence. He will be interviewed by Sam Norich, and you can buy this wonderful new book on YIVO's website, and I will put a bunch of links in the chat over the next few minutes, and one of those will be the link to purchase this book. So a bit about YIVO. Those of you who do not know us, we are a very special place for the celebration, contemplation, and exploration of Yiddish in Eastern European Jewish culture. We're located in New York City, where our library and archive contains over 24 million documents and 400,000 books. And these resources are used by researchers and scholars from all around the world. We also have lots of classes on Yiddish language and culture and programs just like this one, where we aim to bridge the worlds of Jewish culture and our vast library and archival holdings. We are very excited to have you joining us today. Joseph Berger was a New York Times reporter, columnist, and editor for 30 years. He continues to contribute periodically. He has taught urban affairs at the City University of New York's Macaulay Honors College. He's the author of Displaced Persons, Growing Up American After the Holocaust, and he lives in New York City. And we also have Sam Norich joining us today. He served as executive director of the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research from 1980 to 1992, and is vice president of the World Jewish Congress from 1975 to 1981. He is the author of What Will Bind Us Now, a report on the institutional ties between Israel and American Jewry, and he currently serves as the president of the Forward Association. He was the publisher and chief executive of the English and Yiddish Forward for 2 decades until he retired in 2017. So thank you all for joining us for this book talk, and I will now hand it over to Sam and Joe.
Thank you, Julia. And thank you, Joe, for doing this conversation. In trying to figure out how do I begin, I had actually a novel idea. I was thinking about the themes in Elie Wiesel's life and went back to the beginning of Joe's biography of Elie Wiesel, which I think sets out those themes better than I was able to do in my own mind. So I'd like to start, actually, by asking Joe, would you read a couple of paragraphs, a few paragraphs from the introduction to this book?
My pleasure, Sam. And just want to say that I have known Sam for probably more than 40 years. We met when he was executive director of YIVO, and I was assigned to a story about YIVO. I don't remember what the story was, but there've been many over the years. So, and it's nice to have you as a friend as well. So let me take.
We're doing this conversation on Zoom alone because Joe is recuperating from a bout of COVID. Fortunately, not a very bad bout. And I want to wish you a refuah shlema, but let's launch in.
Well, you did yesterday, and today the doctor told me I can go and go out into the world.
Good.
I don't have to self-isolate anymore.
Good.
Thank you.
So
let me read an excerpt. This is from the introduction. To his admirers, Elie Wiesel had the aura of a prophet. He spoke with eloquent simplicity about grand moral themes, balancing his paradoxical phrases so that listeners absorbed his message into their marrow. Whether explicitly or by suggestion, he summoned a personal history that had endured human malice in his flesh. As an orphan survivor and witness to Auschwitz and Buchenwald, he spoke with unusual authority. At times, his strikingly chiseled face had a haunted cast that the French novelist Francois Mauriac described as the look of Lazarus, the acolyte whom Jesus was said to have raised from the dead. And yet those who knew him well remarked how deeply human and unaffected he was. He loved to sing, to join with friends in the Hasidic melodies he had grown up with in Sighet, Romania, where he was born, to join in whirling Hasidic wedding dances. He savored the quirks and flavors of Yiddish, his first language, and loved to laugh at a salty Yiddish joke. Though he walked with kings and queens at the climax of his career, he remained a man of modest tastes. He hated wearing tuxedos, took minimal interest in financial matters. And as his son Elisha told me, he preferred instant coffee to the brewed variety because that was what he had been accustomed to in Europe. In old age, he told friends he wanted to be remembered not for his prestigious honors or as the author of a landmark book about the Holocaust or as a speaker on the world stage, but simply as the teacher he had been for more than 40 years.
Thanks, Joe. For me, there are many questions that I want to ask about Wiesel and about your reading of Wiesel. I guess the first question would be, how did a man of such modest beginnings, raised in a largely Hasidic village in a rural part of what is today Romania, was then Hungary, become the messenger to the world that the Nobel citation described him as, the messenger to mankind. There's a line in Wordsworth where he says, the child is father to the man, meaning there are things that form a person in childhood that come to the fore in adulthood. What was it in Wiesel's childhood that enabled him to be a spokesman for the Jews and to the Jews?
Well, Wiesel became a polished intellectual, a cultivated intellectual. But had there been no war, he probably would have ended up a Hasidic, maybe a rabbi in this Hungarian Romanian village of Sighet. Interestingly, many of his characteristics that he was known for were formed in his childhood in that Hasidic village. His love of Yiddish, his fervor for Judaism, the way he sang, and he was a wonderful singer, his expressiveness, all those came from that Hasidic background. You know, we know him as an intellectual and a secular man, a cultivated man, but those emotional qualities, they grew up, came from Sighet. His mother, who was Hasidic herself, was also an unusual woman in that she read magazines from that were sent from Paris and other places. So she had a taste for culture. His father wanted him to learn the violin, and he did. And that was a kind of unusual as well. And finally, Elie had a very fine mind that made very careful distinctions. And that, I think, came from his Talmudic background. Mm-hmm. He was a wonderful Talmud student by all accounts. In the yeshiva he went to, the school he went to in Sighet, and all those qualities together.
He must have exercised those muscles when he was a student at the Sorbonne.
Well, that's what I was going to say. A key turning point, and at the end of the war, Elie was an orphan. His mother was killed immediately upon arrival at Auschwitz. His father stayed with him through Buchenwald, but ultimately because of beatings he received and because of starvation, he succumbed a few days before liberation. And Elie was an orphan in a I guess ironic way. It was fortunate because he joined an orphan train, a train that had been sent by de Gaulle, who had agreed to take 400 orphans into France, and they were put up in a Jewish orphanage in Normandy. Eventually, switched to one outside of Paris. Once he was outside of Paris, he started taking courses at the Sorbonne in philosophy, in literature, and he became a very different person. He was, he was reading philosophers of the Enlightenment. He hung around with Jean-Paul Sartre at Parisian cafes. So he had a very different exposure, and that gave him a certain intellectual heft that many survivors couldn't match, because when they got out of the camps or out of hiding or wherever they had spent the war, they had to go to work right away and take care of their families. But Elie had this background, which gave him a real advantage in terms of his ability to relate to a more popular world.
Yeah. So how did Elie, as a person brought up with Chumash and Gemara, steeped in Jewish religious culture, deal with the carnage that he saw around him, the death of almost everyone he knew, and the destruction of the community, that the wider European Jewish world that he knew? How did he make peace with a omnipresent, beneficent God after the tortures he had gone through?
It was a long evolutionary process. In his classic Night, he describes an event that took place, though there's controversy with the details, but 3 men, Elie said 2 men and a boy, were hung for whatever reason. I don't think Elie knew, were hung off in gallows in Auschwitz. And it was so sickening to see these bodies hanging there that Elie confronted his anger at God in such a way that he said, "Where is God? Where are you?" And he said to himself, "God is hanging on the gallows," as if God was dead, to use an expression of a movement that took place in years later. Yeah. So Elie at first was furious at God, wondering where was he? How could he let 1 million children be killed by the Nazis, let alone 6 million Jews altogether? And it led to a certain cynicism at first, but over time, as Elie's life was enhanced by marriage, by having a son, he softened, and he found himself coming back to Jewish practice, Jewish ritual, and deciding that because he's angry at God, why should he take it out on Shabbos? to use his expression.
Yeah.
And he wore tefillin. He joined an Orthodox synagogue. And I interviewed him when he won the Nobel Prize. There was a press conference, and I asked him, how can you believe in, what do you say to yourself about your belief in God, given all that you saw? And he says, we argue, but I've grown closer to him for that reason.
You remind me that the first time that I encountered Elie was at the General Assembly of the Council of Jewish Federations in 1972, where he was invited to speak on Shabbos afternoon about Shabbos in Siget. And he began by singing a Vishnitzer Nicken. Wenn ich wollt gehabt Koyach, wollte ich in die Gassen gelaufen und geschrien heuer, oi Shabbos. I'm not a singer. He was. To this audience, I should mention, actually, this is a side thing, I should mention that my colleague at YIVO, Adrian Cooper, Zichrono Livracha, took that song and made it a hymn for peace. Wenn ich wollt gehabt Koyach, wollte ich in die Gassen gelaufen und geschrien Shalom. But I also remember from that encounter that he told this story about evoking his education as a child. He told this story about having been on a plane from New York to LA a couple of years earlier, and a Lubavitcher came up to him on the plane, a Chabad Chassid, who asked him, "Are you Jewish?" And Wiesel said, "Yeah, I'm Jewish." And the man said, "Would you put on tefillin?" And Wiesel said, "You know, I was a little bit miffed. First of all, what's it his business? And secondly, how does he know that I didn't already put on tefillin that day?" And but you know, he was a Lubavitcher, so you don't take offense. That's what they often do. And he asked the man, "Tell me, if you can answer my shaila, if you can answer my question, I'll put on tefillin." What's the question? If you're an astronaut and you are going around and around the world and you see the sun come up every 90 minutes, when do you put on tefillin? So he said that Lubavitcher didn't know the answer. All he could say was, why would a Jew want to go around and around the world? And he asked several, and finally he asked a great learned man who told him that the din in this matter has to do with like commercial travelers, people who go to the borders beyond any Jewish community. They put on tefillin not when they see the sun come up, but at the same time as the community, the minyan that they left, the nearest minyan, presumably. So the astronaut puts on tefillin at the same time as Cape Canaveral puts on tefillin. And that was his teaching for that afternoon. The point being, in Siget, you couldn't make Shabbos for yourself. you had to make Shabbos with the community. The first time that Wiesel went to Israel was actually soon after his liberation in 1949. He got a journalistic assignment, and he went to Israel, and he went with thoughts of Israel in hallowed tones, but he encountered a very problematic attitude on the part of some Israelis. That is a disdain, as you put it in the book, a disdain for survivors that not only he, but many survivors in Israel in the 40s and 50s encountered, maybe less so later on. Can you say a bit about that?
Well, he felt that the Israelis viewed the survivors as having gone to their deaths, to use the cliche, like sheep, that they should have fought back. He was dealing with Israelis who were people who had settled the land, brought a certain kind of pluck and courage to that, and felt that what had happened to survivors was a sign of weakness. But in fact, Wiesel had to tell them, if you had been there, you would have seen that we had no choice. The way things evolved. For example, he pointed out that many people didn't believe that they had no foresight as to the kind of cruelty that the Germans could impose. They looked back at World War I and said, well, it wasn't so bad under the Germans.
Right.
And so many of the communities deluded themselves. And then, of course, the cruelty was so I don't know what to say, over the top. People would shoot you if you opposed anything that they wanted you to do or hesitated, and they would go out of their way to sadistically kill children in front of the adults, so that you were dealing with a whole new way of thinking about the enemy.
Yeah.
And so he was able to do that, but it left a sour taste in his with Elie.
Yeah.
But over the years, the Israelis themselves began to realize what the survivors had been through.
Yeah.
And began honoring the survivors with a Holocaust Day once a year, and other events like that, so that he realized that they had shifted on that, and so that eased his feelings about Israel.
Yeah. Actually, those attitudes persisted at least into the 1980s. They may be less marked now on the part of Israelis, or some Israelis, but I think you and I actually met at the World Gathering 36 years after the liberation of the camps, meaning in June of 1981. When you went to cover the event on behalf of, was it the New York Post or the Newsday? Newsday at the time, right? And I remember a Israeli reporter sticking a microphone in my face and asking me, so tell me, why did they go like sheep to the slaughter? And I just, all I was able to say was, you don't know anything and you don't want to know anything. But it certainly gave Wiesel problems, and I think you deal with it in a very telling and very compelling way in the book.
But Wiesel never lost his love for Israel. He had very strong feelings till the end of his life. Sometimes, to the dismay of the peace crowd in Israel,
Right,
and in America.
right.
But he told himself that he was not going to criticize Israel. He had a bad experience the first time he tried it. He gave a speech around 1973, 74 to the Jewish Agency.
Mm-hmm.
He wondered, why can't Israelis show a little more compassion for the plight of the Palestinians? And he was greeted by newspaper articles, and the Israelis are not shy about expressing themselves,
Right.
Saying, "Why are you a diaspora Jew telling us how to live our lives?"
Yeah.
And he was so taken aback by the criticism that he basically decided he wasn't going to criticize Israel at all, and he didn't, not even with events like Sabra and Shatila.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, he faced some criticism from American liberals, including a lot of American Jews, when he placed a full-page ad in the Times in 2010 urging Obama to stop criticizing Bibi Netanyahu for settlements, for expanding settlements in the West Bank. And again in 2015, when he came out against the proposed treaty with Iran on limiting their capability for nuclear weapons. And in both of those instances, there were people who criticized him here. I want to ask you about Night. After the Diary of Anne Frank, I think more people learned about the Holocaust from Wiesel's book Night than from any other single source, certainly up until the 1970s. It had a powerful effect. What gave it that powerful effect? What set Night apart among many other novels and reportage about the destruction of European Jewry, about the Khurban?
Well, first of all, the story of Night is quite interesting, and I get to answer your question as well. When Elie Wiesel wrote Night, the first English edition sold about 1,000 copies. The next year, it sold another 1,000 copies. This was about 1960, 61, I guess is when it was published. The fact was that there was a silence that had fallen over the discussion of the Holocaust. The survivors felt Americans, looking at it in America, the survivors felt Americans couldn't quite understand what they'd been through. and Americans may have been guilty that they hadn't done more to save and rescue Jews caught up in the Holocaust. And there was a kind of generalized trauma that just kept the subject. You know, I went to a yeshiva. We never discussed the Holocaust. You would think that would be a major subject, but we never had any lessons in what had happened. I think everyone would felt, you know, it's too painful to talk about. So there was this silence, and it only really ended first with the Eichmann trial, but more so with the miraculous Israeli victory in 1967. Suddenly, the pride that welled up as a result of that led many Jews to want to find out what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And there was interest in general Jewish history, but also in the Holocaust itself. And when synagogues wanted a speaker, there was Elie Wiesel. He was articulate. He had lived through the Holocaust, and he wrote a book. And the book became, suddenly the sales figures started going through the roof, mm-hmm. Year after year. And eventually, so that was the story about the popularity of Night. Eventually, the figure I use in the book is 14 million copies have been sold worldwide. Probably one of the most popular books of all time. What made it so is that not only did Wiesel describe the pain and the misery and the cruelty of Auschwitz and Buchenwald, but he tackled bigger themes like where was God? Though that kind of thoughtfulness, that kind of intellectual grappling, was not present in other memoirs, in many other memoirs. Interestingly, his initial edition of Night soft-pedaled his anger at the world leaders for not taking in more Jews, for not bombing the train tracks to Auschwitz. Wiesel was accused of pulling his punches. Mm-hmm. But Wiesel went on to vehemently criticize much of the Christian world for its tolerance of what took place during the war, and so it wasn't that Wiesel was too afraid to criticize, but when he wrote the book, he was a young man and a young writer. This was his first book. Mm-hmm. So that there may have been an effort to develop a public, a readership for the book.
Yeah. Another book that had a huge impact was The Jews of Silence, a book that he published, I think, in 1966. And you described in your biography how he came to visit the Soviet Union the first time in 1965, just arriving just before Rosh Hashanah and staying through Simchas Torah, and the impact that visit had on him. It became a rallying cry for a movement that mobilized certainly tens of thousands of American Jews. But, it was late in coming. The Jews of silence were the Jews of the diaspora who hadn't raised their voices on behalf of Russian Jews. What, in your view, stands out about his reporting in Jews of Silence? What stands out? What gave that book such impact?
First of all, let me just say that many people who are familiar with Elie Wiesel don't know that he spent about 25 years as a working journalist. Much of his career was as a journalist. And he went to the Soviet Union on the advice of some Israelis he knew, and who told him there'd be a good story there. And he when he got there, he saw how repressed Jewish life was. Mm-hmm. There were, very few synagogues, and religious practice was kind of almost disallowed for much of the year. The one day that for some reason the Soviets allowed an expression of Jewish fervor was Simchat Torah, and Wiesel was very taken with the fervor he saw mm-hmm. in Soviet Jews that they had been so repressed by Soviet laws that there was this outpouring on that day. So he saw Soviet Jews dancing with the Torah. He was very moved, and he described it very lyrically. And the book, because it taught many American Jews about what the situation was in the Soviet Union, had a huge impact. Mm-hmm. And it happened just at a time, it came out just at a time when the Soviets were looking to make deals with the West because mm-hmm. people were going hungry because food shortages in the Soviet Union.
Right.
So they were looking for deals, and America was able to use that as a bargaining chip. And the Soviets released, I forget whether it's 200,000 Soviet Jews were allowed to emigrate.
Yeah.
So, but Wiesel's book, because it was so beautifully written, became like the textbook of the movement. Other people contributed, but that book was essential.
Yeah. Wiesel was, of course, the first chairman of the council that created the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. You assess his role in that position actually rather critically. And I wanted to ask you to talk about how Wiesel saw that role, what you think he succeeded in doing, and what had to be left for others to do.
When you say that I saw it critically, Elie Wiesel saw it critically. He wrote about his own failure in his, he wrote a 2-volume memoir. And in it, he described his own, in great detail, mm-hmm. his own failures as a manager. He was not cut out to be a manager, an administrator. It just wasn't, that wasn't Elie.
Right.
And, and he gets credit, I believe, for inspiring the creation of a museum and for making sure that it was a museum centered on the law, on the murder of 6 million Jews, not just a general text on genocide.
Yeah.
A general display on genocide. it does that, but it really is very much focused on the Holocaust. And so Elie Wiesel gives enormous credit for that. But, you know, as I kind of hint, Elie probably couldn't handle a kitchen renovation. It wasn't his strength. His own wife will tell you that he was not a very practical guy, and he was not a man of steeped in financial affairs. This wasn't Elie.
Yeah.
And those were duties he wasn't able to handle. So when the council spent 8 years discussing issues like how Jewish the museum should be and what other genocide should be included, he loved those discussions, but nothing was being built. So they brought in a guy who builds malls, Sonny Abramson. He built malls in the Washington area, and he knew how to build a museum. And and Elie essentially resigned his position, admitting that management and finance and the other skills he needed were not his forte.
Yeah.
So and of course the museum became this magnificent creation and probably the second most popular site in Washington.
Rightly. I think I have, before we go to questions from our listeners and viewers, I wanted to ask you to speak about the Bitburg debacle, you described vividly the courage that Wiesel demonstrated in confronting Ronald Reagan before he went to Bitburg and imploring him to go to a different place. Can you say a bit about that?
Well, Ronald Reagan decided to go to Germany to kind of seal the bond of friendship between the two countries after World War II, and Helmut Kohl, the prime minister of Germany, persuaded him to go visit a cemetery and lay a wreath. The cemetery happened to contain, I forget the number, but several dozen graves of SS members, those who were charged in killing Jews. When word got out that he was going to go to this cemetery at Bitburg, an uproar ensued, and everyone looked to Elie to make a statement, because he was, at that point, he was already the chief spokesman for the Holocaust survivors. He was head of the council that was building the museum in Washington. So everyone looked to Elie, and he made some statements, and that would have been it, except for a fortuitous twist. Turned out that Elie was due to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor, and it happened just around the same time. And the Congressional Medal of Honor is always given by the President of the United States. So Reagan had to hand Elie Wiesel this award at this within a couple of weeks before he was leaving for Bitburg. The administration, the Reagan administration, was so upset at the possibility of a confrontation that they switched the room at the White House where the ceremony would take place from the very large, I think it's the East Room, to the Roosevelt Room, which only holds 40 people. Well, Wiesel very shrewdly made sure that, and they cut his guest list from like 50 to 5. Well, among the 5 people, besides his wife and son, were the head of the Abe Rosenthal of the New York Times and Arthur Gelb of the New York Times. And eventually it was good. The publicity was such that it was also televised. So Wiesel took the award and had to make a little speech. And let me read you how it transpired. If I can find it quickly. Here we go. He said to the president, and he wasn't lecturing the president as it was sometimes described. It was done in very menschlich way, if I may use the word.
May.
He said to the president, I am convinced, as you have told us earlier when we spoke, that you were not aware of the presence of SS graves in the Bitburg cemetery. Of course you didn't know, but now we all are aware. May I, Mr. President, if it's possible at all, implore you to do something else, to find a way, to find another way, another site. That place, Mr. President, is not your place. Your place is with the victims of the SS. Now, no one had ever spoken to a president in the White House like that. It became a signal movement. It was the front page of all the newspapers the next day. There were several stories in some of the newspapers. So it became a fiasco for Reagan, and a blot on his legacy, however he saw it.
Yeah. Tell me, what was the genesis of your biography? How did this book come to be? Well,
I had written an advance obituary. The Times does advance obituaries. We have, the last time I looked, we had 1,700 advance obituaries. Famous people, powerful people, interesting people, novel people. We want to make sure we have a very good, very well-written, well-researched obituary on them. And so about 10 years before Elie Wiesel actually died, I had written his advance obituary. I probably updated it. And in doing so, not only was I very much taken with the arc of his life, how did this Hasidic boy in a shtetl, as he says, in Romania, Hungary, come to be the torchbearer of the survivors and the spokesman, the leading spokesman against genocide in the world, and Nobel Prize winner to boot. And so I felt that his life was almost cinematic, and it had this wonderful arc that I thought would make for a very interesting biography, and I enjoyed working on it.
I have to say that this is a meticulously researched book. I thought I knew something about Wiesel's life. I had followed it. Anybody who was paying any attention to the Jewish story of the last half century had to have been aware of Wiesel and seen some of these high points that we've talked about in his life. But you spoke, and this couldn't have been done for the advanced biography. I mean, a journalist has to put together a lot of information very quickly. And even if it was an advanced biography, there was a limit to how much research you could do. But you seem to have had no limit in how much research you did for this book. And you spoke to Mariam Wiesel, his wife, to Elisha Wiesel, his son. You spoke to close friends. You read correspondence in the Boston University archive that Wiesel left. You went through his speeches that are quoted at various points in the book. I thought that you really got to an intimate portrait of a world famous figure, and I didn't want to. I wanted to say how much I admired the work you put into this.
Well, thank you very much.
We have a few questions. I want to again ask you to put your questions in the Q&A. I see that there are actually more questions in the chat than there are in the Q&A, but I'll start with the Q&A and maybe move to the chat. But again, if you have a chance, please put a question into the Q&A. Our friend Reb Moshe Waldox asks, tell us a bit about his Parisian teacher, Shoshani.
Shoshani was this mystical figure who Wiesel encountered at the orphanage at first, and later on in Paris. Apparently a brilliant Talmudist who spoke a dozen languages, and Wiesel was very impressed with his interpretation of Torah and Talmud, and he had enormous influence in getting Wiesel to, as a young adult, to want to explore the ins and outs of Judaism. But he seems to have disappeared from Wiesel's life at some point, and kind of a mysterious figure. Even his name is mysterious. Mm-hmm. The Shoshani was a kind of a nickname, and I forget now what his actual name was.
Yeah,
but he did exist. You see, with Wiesel, you're not always sure, because Wiesel had this fascination with madmen and mystics, and sometimes he would have a figure repeat in several of his novels, who was a madman who was somehow voicing truths that no one else was. Mm-hmm. And Wiesel was believed that madmen had something to contribute along those lines.
Mark Schneider asks, talk about the original Und die Welt hat geschwiegen.
I'm sorry? Talk about the
original version of Night. Und die Welt hat geschwiegen.
And the world was silent.
Right.
Right. Wiesel claimed that he wrote the book Night, 800 and something pages, on a boat trip from New York to, not from New York, it was from Israel to Buenos Aires. And in Buenos Aires, he had the good fortune of meeting an editor who was putting together a collection of Holocaust memoirs.
Mark Turkov.
Mark Turkov, yes. And did you know Mark Turkov?
Yes, I did.
We will talk about that. Anyway, Turkov had him cut down the book to something closer to 200 and something pages. And that became the Yiddish version of Night. And the Yiddish version of Night was much more direct in its anger at Germany, at Germans, at the population of Germany, at the world leaders like Churchill and Roosevelt, who hadn't done more to rescue Jews, at the fact that the Catholic Church did very little to stop Hitler from the repression he put forward, when Wiesel was in Paris, he encountered Francois Mauriac, hoping Mauriac would help him get an interview with Pierre Mendès France. But in meeting Mauriac, they had a bit of an argument, over the interpretation of the Holocaust as a sacrifice, like the sacrifice of Jesus. And Wiesel told Mauriac, "I know children who suffered more than Jesus did." That as a result of that argument and the discussion afterwards, Mauriac said to Wiesel, "Well, why don't you write down what you told me, and tell me about your experiences in Auschwitz and Buchenwald?" And Wiesel said, "I already have." And that became the French edition of Night, with the title change from "And the World Was Silent." And the change of the title tells you that Wiesel softened the anger at the world. But as some of the people I quote in the book, he was a young writer. He had this patron, Francois Mauriac, a Nobel Prize winning in literature, and he felt that he wasn't going to antagonize Mauriac or the Catholic world, because he wanted the main themes of his book to see the light of day.
They sure did. Jean Hummel asks, what's your opinion on the widely criticized Wiesel insistence on the, quote, uniqueness, unquote, of the Holocaust, and that no comparisons or parallels can be considered?
Well, this was an argument that came to the fore in the creation of the museum. And Wiesel would argue that while many Poles died, they didn't die because they were Polish. They died out of random cruelty, out of as a result of war. But the Jews were specifically targeted as Jews. It didn't matter that they were upper class, poor, educated, uneducated, observant or non-observant. If they were Jewish, they were headed for either slaughter or slavery. He had a phrase. Not all victims were Jewish, but all Jews were victims, is the way he put it. And it was the only group that was true of.
Yeah. This could go on for many hours, but a Zoom conversation doesn't last more than one. So I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up. I want to thank you for the gift you've given us all in working so hard for so many years to produce such a wonderful book. And I want to urge our viewers and listeners to contact YIVO, where you can buy the book. It's only out now, and the printing got delayed, but you can get your own copy, and I urge you to read it. Again, I wish you a refuah shlema, and look forward to continuing the conversation offline when we see each other.
Okay, I look forward to that too.